Also realized that my original title was very wordy and dropped it down to something that can be consumed. Yeah. Yep, I completely forgot about that. Yeah. Okay, a little bit about me. My name is Andrew McCann. I'm a software developer at Visio Media. Quick shout out, we're hiring, looking for like intermediate dev if anyone's interested. Come talk to me later. You can contact me at andrewmccann.dev. And yeah, that's really about it. So for this rest of this presentation, if you have any questions or want to make any comments, feel free to just call out. I really like audience feedback, so it makes the presentation better, and I don't do a great job of explaining things, so if you have a question, probably everyone else in the room does as well. All right, so I'm going to start by just listing 3 options for how you could use React and Rails together as your front-end, back-end framework. One of them is kind of a cheat because it's not using Rails at all, or React at all. It's just pure Rails. The other is sort of like a React-Rails hybrid, and the last is like a pure React SPA and a Rails backend. I picked these 3 options because they're sort of like equidistant on the spectrum of options, where it's like we have one that's pure Rails, one that's pure React front end with the Rails API, and then one that kind of merges the two right in the middle. They're also all things that I've used in a production system and have seen personally how they can kind of scale. So that's why I picked these options. So I'm going to start by just kind of explaining what each of these names mean. So pure Rails is probably exactly what everyone expects. You're using ERB templates, CoffeeScript, and maybe TurboLinks for your front end. So you have a Rails backend with those 3 pieces in your front end. There's a tutorial for how to use Rails. I linked it. I suspect most people in the room have used Rails in the past, but if not, this link is in the presentation that I sent out over Slack. Here's a quick idea of how that architecture works. You have a single Rails code base that gets pushed up to Heroku, or at least that's how I deploy my Rails applications. And then that moves out, and the computers and the end users kind of interact with your Heroku hosted Rails application. So that's the first thing that we'll be on the comparison block. The second is React and Rails. So it's a merge of the 2 concepts. So you can still build React components via the React Rails gem, but you're still using concepts that are Railsy.
You would actually use TurboLinks, would you?
You can. I personally don't like TurboLinks, but I've seen them used effectively in the past by people that aren't me. So I think that might be a personal failing and not an issue with TurboLinks themselves. So what does this merging of these 2 things look like? So if you have you create a web component, or React component, and you just drop it in your JavaScript folder, it's a standard React component. You don't really have to do anything special here. The key thing to note is that when you're rendering it to your ERB, which is how you render your React components, you just render it using a helper. So you call React component, pass in the name of the component, and then the props you want to give it. What's different here is that unlike a pure React SPA, you're not composing React components of other React components. You can do that, where every page just has a single React component on it that nests a bunch under it. But you can also build something like a credit card form and just embed that somewhere in your application. So it's a React credit card form that has all the nice UI that you get from a React or a React component, but it's still in a Rails thing, and it transitions pages in the same way that you transition pages in normal Rails. So this looks basically identical to the Heroku or to the normal Rails application, where you ship your code as one package to Heroku, and then your end users interact with it there. So that's option 2. Option 3, which is, I think, the more interesting one, that might be a little bit of bias there, is Rails backend. So you're using API-only mode in Rails, and you're using a React front end. I personally use Webpack as my way of shipping that in the front, or compiling that in the front end. Here's a tutorial that is fantastic. It matches very similar to the system we're using in production right now, which is we have this structure where we have a Rails backend and a React front end. This gets you almost to the same place. The one difference is in our production system, which is the way I like to do this, you have two different code bases. So you have your Rails code base and your React code base. You deploy them independently of one another to two different servers, and then those servers communicate with each other in order to produce the application. And then your end users basically just use the React application. A nice thing about the React application is you can swap out the front end. You can use CloudFront and just compile to a static asset, ship that to CloudFront. You can use Nginx. There's a lot of options. I still would use Heroku for the Rails, and I'm personally going to be using Heroku for the React side, but mostly because of familiarity with Heroku and not because it's the right choice.
If it's just a static payload, why wouldn't you just host it on your single Rails app and just serve it from there?
You certainly can. My primary reason for not doing is I want to keep those two code bases separate. Like my Rails application code is pretty different. Like it has a different set of responsibilities than my React front-end code. So I want to keep them separate. I could compile it and then push it into my Rails application, but
Seems like you're doubling your costs, but you're pretty big with Heroku.
it's not terrible because like for a React application, you really just need to serve it, right? So it's about, my current cost I think is $7 a month for serving that, and then the back end is where all the expense comes in.
Sure.
Yeah. But yes, that is definitely a thing that you can do. Cool. Right. So on to the comparison. So I've compared it over about 5 categories. There are a lot more and a lot of things that I didn't cover in this. But these are the ones that I kind of like, these are the things that I would evaluate it on. And if I had to make this decision in the future, these are the first things that came to my mind. First and foremost is look and feel. So for a pure Rails application, comparing it to a React application, page transitions tend to feel a little bit slow or clunky because unlike in single page application, you're transitioning your page between every request. Every button click kind of like goes to a new page. You can like add in turbo links to kind of like mitigate that or customize JavaScript to like kind of make it so that like maybe you don't want to load a full page, you want to load a dialogue. There's a lot of things you can do, but it's not out of the box. It's something you kind of have to like add in after the fact. So like doing it the pure Rails way does tend to lead to like less JavaScript interaction and less interactivity on a page. Dynamic page state is difficult to manage as well. So like what you tend to want in an application versus a content site, which I've separated them into these two categories, is an application has dynamic interaction on the page. You click a button on the top right corner, you want something else to happen on the page. You like start filling something out, you want that information to propagate to all the areas on the page that information is showing. Doing that in a pure Rails application is difficult. It's not impossible. You can do it with JavaScript, but it starts to become a little unwieldy. If you're merging React and Rails in the way I was describing before, it has the same page transition issue that Rails has, primarily because it's using the same framework. Like we're rendering a little bit more dynamic content that is a lot easier to manage, which makes it a little bit better. So orange being better than red. But it's not a drastic improvement. It's a slight improvement, but it does let you manage things like credit card forms that need to be highly interactive, and yeah. And then a React single page application. So one thing to note is this is React single page application built well. You can build them in poor ways that also feel slow and clunky, that do what seem like full page transitions, or like there isn't a lot of dynamic aspects going on. But if you're doing it like in the React way, following the tutorials, kind of like doing it as you would expect to build a React single page application, they tend to be incredibly responsive. So you tend to like click a button and something instantaneously happens. Transitions between pages feel seamless. It feels like you're using a native application. So you don't have to wait for a lot of load time. Like there's a lot of easy strategies to implement to kind of like give skeleton frameworks when you're like loading a page so it doesn't look like it's loading, or loading old cache data while you're loading the new data underneath. So it like allows very seamless transitions between things, which is really nice. And dynamic page state is built in. Like if you're using React, the dynamic nature of like modifying a text field and it updating everywhere in the UI where that text field is used, you get effectively for free. you don't really need to think about if you're building it in a React way.
For the React Rails like hybrid in the middle,
Yep.
the dynamic page state. When I saw kind of that snippet that you showed of like equals React component, and
Yep.
you're passing a hash as the argument.
Yep.
That felt like that was like server-side static data.
Yes.
Is there a way that you actually can use like a state management, like JS-based state management?
Yes, so there are solutions to add, so like Ben said, the example I showed with React Rails, it did all of the rendering of the React component server side, so that the state wasn't constantly dynamic. There are ways you can make the state between React components dynamic and update each other. It's not trivial to implement, but it can be done, and you get a bit more of that dynamic look and feel. It just requires more effort on your part because you don't have like a top-level component that is feeding all of the data down. You kind of have 3 separate components and maybe something that's tying them all together. All right, and then for the content websites, none of these are particular, like the look and feel of like, I'm thinking Investopedia style thing. You don't get a whole lot of advantages of going with React or Rails or the middle option. They're all pretty much identical. So the next thing I want to call out is the learning curve. So Rails, I'm just assuming at this point, this is kind of geared toward people who understand Rails already. There's not a huge learning curve. If you know Rails, so you don't really need to learn anything new. You can just do whatever you want. There's also a ton of really good tutorials if you don't know Rails yet, and that's something you want to get into. For the React Rails hybrid approach, primarily there's 1 or 2 Meldium posts on like how to combine these things, and the gem itself explaining how to do it. And that's the extent of the tutorials. So you're going to have to learn a lot on your own. In my experience, as soon as you add turbo links, it tends to work really well until it doesn't. And then that combination is incredibly hard to debug. You can't quite figure out what went wrong in an easy way. One advantage is if you're moving from a pure Rails application background to this, you get to build things in a Railsy way. So if you understand Rails, this isn't a massive jump. You basically just think of React components as partials that have a bit more JavaScript dynamic pieces built in. So you can kind of like use your familiar concepts and like transition into this like React Rails hybrid. As far as React goes, again, a lot of high quality tutorials. React has done really, really well for itself in the last few years. So everyone is using it and everyone has a tutorial on whatever combination of systems you want to use with it and the great ways you can build a React single page application. It is, however, a very different way of thinking of the front end than you do in a Rails application. Rails is more geared towards thinking of like your back end and front end as the same system and only occasionally really needing to know that there is actually web communication going on between them. Whereas a React single page application requires you to understand the back end. You're interacting with an API, at least to some degree, and you can't really think of anything in a Railsy way anymore. You're just thinking about it as like, I'm interacting with an API, and that API happens to be Rails, but I can kind of ignore that. Next category I have as initial build speed. So this is where I think Rails shines. Like it is like leagues ahead of React on building out a full application for someone in a short period of time. They provide things like active storage, so you don't really need to figure out how do I direct upload to S3, how do I send that file over the server, how do I protect forms to make sure that they're like not being forged. So how do you protect forms from forgery? Action Cable is fantastic. If you want to build a chat application, Action Cable is a pretty good way to do that. So it basically tries to separate that need to understand what you're really doing and just use the built-in things, and you can get something up and running really quickly. Yeah, so that's the primary advantage of using a pure Rails app. React Rails, you're adding the complexity of React without a lot of the gain that you get from having React. So if you're like looking to optimize for initial build, using that hybrid is probably the worst option because it adds confusion and doesn't have a lot of like familiar concepts and removes a lot of the stuff that you get for free from like pure Rails. You can still use some of it, but it's a lot more confusing than it needs to be. And then a React single page application. Like I said before, there's a lot of high quality tutorials. So if you want to get something up and running quick, there's probably someone that can show you how. There's a lot of UI libraries that you can pull from, so you don't have to build everything yourself, which is nice, but it's not quite at the same level as a pure Rails application. Maintainability. This is where I think Rails starts to fall down, or at least it has in my experience. As an application gets more complicated, you tend to have a lot of JS complexity added to it. Like, when you first did this initial build, you didn't expect a lot of the interactivity that you're going to have once your company starts succeeding, and you need to be iterating on this and like making it more dynamic as time goes on. CoffeeScript I really don't like for maintainability. It kind of like hides JavaScript away from you, but in ways that don't quite make sense, or at least to me. And yeah, as I said before, as you grow, JavaScript gets a lot more difficult to manage. That's where something like React Rails starts to like provide a lot of value, is once you're starting to get to that level, if you're already on a Rails application, adding React Rails is easy, and you can start managing that JavaScript complexity. And then a React single page application is purely designed for managing JavaScript complexity and front-end complexity. It is a very good tool for doing that. So if you have a lot of complexity in your front end, it's a fantastic thing to do. It will let you maintain the system a lot easier. Rails controllers are a little bit more difficult to maintain, mostly because it's really easy to like let your concerns leak into your front end, and pulling those out gets difficult at the end, which is another place that React does well. And again, I broke this down into applications and content sites. Yet again, content sites, there's really no advantage to any option. Like they're all pretty equal. React or pure Rails might have a slight advantage there where you only have one system to maintain, but that's about it. And the last category I put up here was performance at scale. So this is kind of where like Rails has issues with front end, like the maintainability aspect, but it is a lot worse at performance. So Rails is kind of designed to like hide things from you. Like you don't really need to know what's going on in the database when you're building your application. If you know what's going on, you can probably build it in a good way, but it's kind of designed to abstract the database from you, and you only interact with active record. As a result, you often end up with a lot of accidental calls to the database from your views. So you don't know what's happening. It's not terrible to track down, but it's a bit of a pain. Reloading large amount of content on each page transition. This is where SPAs kind of shine. You don't really have to deal with reloading the entire page when you transition between things. You can use old cache data, or you can like load partial data sets from your API. You don't have to download all the assets that you have to download on each page transition. There's definitely a little bit of performance things you have to deal with there, but not quite to the same degree. And ERB. So something I personally haven't run into, but have talked with a lot of people that have, is as your pages get bigger and more complex, ERB starts taking a lot longer to render, and it's a lot more difficult to render a single page when you have dozens of ERB templates that are composing it. Yeah, I think a company I think they're in Vancouver, Clio, they did a lot of this like ERB unwinding. So they took a bunch of like nested ERB files and turned them into a single file because they needed their pages to be a little bit more performant. Back-end performance, active record across the board for everything is going to be kind of the bane of what you're doing. It abstracts the database away from you, so you kind of don't really know what's going on, and it's easy to do things like N+1 queries or make like random small mistakes in the way you're querying your database. React Rails suffers from the exact same issues as pure Rails does. Like it doesn't really get any advantage for performance at scale. It was better on maintainability, but not necessarily performance. And then the React single page application, it has a lot of advantages in terms of performance because you don't hit the database accidentally. You only hit it when you're making API calls and intended to like hit the database. Your content is only reloaded as needed, ideally. That's something I should probably add to this, but you can easily build a front-end application that hits your database far more than you need it to, but it's a lot easier to do. Yeah. Assets can only be loaded once. So that's kind of one of the big things that a lot of the SPA advocates kind of like push is that like you don't have to download images multiple times because they're now in your browser's memory. You don't have to download your JavaScript or your CSS. Like once it's loaded, which has load time implications for the first page load, but after that, it tends to be, yeah, a little bit more performant.
So
Yeah.
with some of the things on here, this page
Yeah.
particularly, I mean, I understand the like architecturally, going
Mhm.
with React, what you've done is that you've actually separated things out.
Yes.
So you've made the database calls in the back end behind the API intentional.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, and so it's not so much an issue with Rails as it is with the knowledge of the people writing the Rails.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
It's really easy with a Rails application to, even if you know
Yeah.
what's going on, to ignore what's going on.
Well, and
Yeah.
just like it's easy with a Rails application to think that you've created a database that's performant when you haven't bothered to add any indexes or anything like
Oh,
that.
absolutely. Yeah.
You know, so I mean, one of the beauties about Rails and one of the downsides at the same time is that, you know, it lessens the knowledge of relational databases.
Yep.
And at the same time allows you to use relational databases in ways that make them non-performant.
Yep. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Basically, all the simplicity that Rails adds has a lot of value, but it's not in like performance or maintainability. It's in simplifying the problem.
Most Rails developers don't know the trade-offs that come with you know, hitting the database or adding an index or or the cost of an index as it is.
I really think, like, going back to kind of the original point, if you're optimizing for, I want to be able to like really quickly build a lot of functionality, a lot of value for a client. A lot of those use cases are not going to be internet scale type applications. So like even that lead in a lot of cases doesn't matter because you're never going to need the scale where that performance can come in, like indexes. You can get away without indexes because you know you're never hitting these tables that have tens of thousands.
Well, you have smaller sets of things.
Yeah.
And it's when your application starts to tank that
And
Yep.
you know, and everyone comes along and goes, oh, what's going on?
Yep.
Yeah, so you got the seed, and like I've seen this happen a bunch, where you get a seed and it looks like everything's great, but then as you scale, things start bogging down all over the place, and extricating yourself from that position where initially it didn't matter because the scale was lower, but as it scales, all of a sudden, like everything has these issues scattered all over the place.
Yep.
Yeah.
That definitely leads into what should we choose? So I think Donald Feniak had actually asked a similar question on this topic in the like YegRB chat, and Michael Deering said it depends, and that basically sums up my entire conversation pretty well. Yeah. 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 So pure Rails. Its advantages is it's really good for building things quickly, like Ben was saying. Like you can get something up and running in a trivial amount of time for a client. It provides a lot of quick and easy to use built-in utilities, so you don't have to go find them. You don't have to go find a direct upload React like library that you want to use. You don't have to build one. You can just use what's there and provide it to you. The cons, it doesn't feel modern. Like if you're building an application, you want it to be as responsive as possible. You don't want to be loading pages every time you're like clicking a button. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it doesn't quite feel the way people expect an application to feel. And it scales poorly, as we were just discussing. So when should you use it? If you have an application with really fuzzy requirements, you don't really know what it's going to be yet, you can iterate a lot quicker, at least in my mind, in a Rails application. So you can build something out, you can tear it down and rebuild it without a lot of effort, whereas when you're like trying to think about what it makes sense the best architecturally, that takes a lot more mental effort, and yeah, you want to have a little bit more nailed down requirements. Not perfect, but a little bit more. If you're prototyping something, I would 100% of the time use Rails. Like if I'm just trying to like get an idea up so that someone can see it and interact with it, I would either use a prototyping tool that doesn't have any back end, or for the next stage, build a Rails application. If you don't want your application to scale, or if you don't need it to scale at the moment, so like if you have a one-off contract job for a local Edmonton company that's probably not going to have more than like 20 people on their site a day, any of the performance or maintainability or scaling issues probably don't matter as Ben was saying. And you want to commit to doing it the Rails way. So one of the things I often see is people building Rails applications and then almost immediately adding incredibly complex JavaScript to get the dynamic nature. If you've chosen Rails, you just kind of like need to commit to Rails. You've decided, I don't want my page to be dynamic right now. Might change in the future as you grow, but that kind of leads into the next option, which is React and Rails. Is it adds that way of managing that JS complexity. And the only time I would personally use it, it might not be the only time it can be used, but is if I was upgrading a Rails application to something more like an SPA, and I needed something in the middle. So if I have, Jobber is a good example, a Rails application that was built out very much in the Railsy way, but we started to need more performance like in the front end, and we needed more like snappy feel, and that look and feel wasn't a requirement when they started. But as they grew, it started to become one. So one way to kind of like start dipping your feet in the water of like building out React components is using the React Rails gem. Is it kind of like lets you build things in the Railsy way still, but start building out pages into React components and eventually converting entire pages at a time. If your eventually, hopefully you can get your entire infrastructure on React, or React, but you never know. And then a React single page application. This is what I'm using in production right now at Visio Media. So it provides a great way of managing your JS complexity, feels modern, enforced separation of concerns, which is fantastic. So your display and business logic are forced to be in separate code bases and written completely independent of one another. You get a little bit performance. It takes a bit longer. That's the big downside here, is it takes a bit longer to build anything because you're kind of building in these two code bases. You have to, I think recently we added like S3 storage to our application, but I couldn't take advantage of active storage. I was only able to take advantage of like the back end half of it and then had to build the front end half on my own. So like there's a lot of slowdown there, but it is an application. There's a lot of dynamic state on the pages. We wanted it to feel modern. Like we're trying to compete with like a Facebook style advertising platform. So we kind of want something that feels like something they're used to using. And we have reasonable confidence, at least at this stage, that we're gonna need to scale it. So because we know we're gonna need to scale, it's easy to like make the choice to use React SPA right now. And now I'll open it up for questions and resources.
So how do you handle testing on a React single-page app when you kind of have two separate applications that you're working with?
Right, so the way we're kind of doing testing right now is we have our front-end tests that test the entirety of like, they're mostly at the unit test level. We don't really test the way it interacts with the API on our front end. We test our API separately, and like, again, we're testing kind of unit test, acceptance test level, or integration test level. And then what we currently don't have, which is our missing piece that I am actively working on getting, is a top layer acceptance business logic test that like Selenium driven goes through our website and kind of tests everything that it's working together. So it's kind of like you actually have three different code bases for your tests. So your JavaScript tests stay in your JavaScript code base, your Rails tests stay in the Rails code base, and then you have a separate Selenium test code base.
By separating the code bases, your testing becomes more complex, right?
Yes.
You have to come up with some sort of an integration between the separate code bases.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we had to.
That's the architectural trade-off.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. We had to like build a staging environment that kind of like has everything working together, and we run our Selenium tests against the staging environment rather than like in our CI. It is going to be triggered by CI, but it's not part of like the commit process.
Do you find that a big challenge is establishing your best practice for how your single-page app needs to interact with the API and always adhering to that? Because I see the big problem with testing is the single-page app is fine and the API is fine, but they're both doing things a different kind of fine.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that we've struggled with a bit is like, where do we put the business logic? So some stuff that like is pure, like it's obvious this is like business logic, it definitely goes in the back end. It's obvious it's display logic, it goes in the front end. But that stuff that kind of like straddles the middle, where you're like validating a form, is that really like your data model layer? Like, do you want that validation at the data model layer? Or is that just really a front-end validation and you want your data model to be mutable to not validate against that? So like those kinds of things is where testing and just figuring out where to put things gets really difficult.
I think a really interesting example of that is something like an invoice with line items like calculation. Where
Yep.
your front end, you want to be dynamic. As they're adding things, you want to be calculating and showing them what their totals and subtotals and tax and everything is. But you're going to send it to the back end. So what are you doing? Are you saving those values that are calculated in the front end? Is the back end doing its own calculations? How do you make sure those are consistent? Because of course you don't want to show a certain value to the customer in the front end
Yep.
and have the actual calculations that happen in the back
You're
end.
probably doubling up on your validations.
Probably, yeah, and your calculations and
Yeah.
And as soon as you double up on validations, there's a chance that they come out of sync and then you're really in trouble.
Definitely,
Yeah.
That was something that was common with big Java interior architectures, is that you would often have multiple validations. You do have to come up with mechanisms for making sure that they're synchronized.
Yep.
And the validation will occur in multiple stages.
Yep.
Because you may push, like you'll have validations at the very back end, like sitting on the database.
Yep.
Constraints and stuff like that.
Yep.
That are actually duplicated up to your business layers and
Yep.
so forth.
Yep.
Another question is, who owns the API?
that is a very good question. So until about 6 months ago, when me and another person who regularly attends this meetup, Donald, joined Visio Media, the separation was they had a back-end developer and a front-end developer. And they kind of like negotiated on what the API should look like. That is a pretty standard practice. Like you kind of have this way of like interacting with each other that is through this single API, and you don't really care how it's implemented on the back end or the front end. Donald and I were both full stack developers. We kind of understand both sides of it and have done that for a very long time. So we're now kind of bridging that gap. I personally like joint ownership. I don't think it scales when you have 10 teams, but when you have one small team, joint ownership of both code bases I think is pretty valuable, and the ability for the front-end engineer to kind of go into the back end and add the thing they need, as long as it's being reviewed by someone who's more specialized in the back end. Yeah.
The reason why I asked is normally the back end owns the API, but they have to be responsive to it. And that's
Yeah.
How your organization scales, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as the organization scales larger, because the app scales larger,
Yeah.
you have people that are dedicated on the front end.
Yeah.
Often,
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
You become more specialized in these sorts of things.
Yeah. And I think there's even like a specialization from like within the back end. There's people that are really good at like the database layer and the system architecture, and there's really good people at building strong, valuable APIs. So like as you scale, again, that separation, as people are able to specialize, they can kind of like pick where they are best and go deep.
Depending,
Yeah.
I mean, you may need, depending on what you have, you may need somebody, if you have somebody that's good at databases.
Yep.
Then they're working with, because they get called here.
Yep.
Is it realistic to consider transitioning a monolith Rails app to a single page app with an API backend without greenfielding and having copy code over?
I think there are companies that have done it. Jobber is currently in the process of trying that. They're working on like making that migration. I think it's almost a requirement to migrate at a certain point, right? Like Jobber can't rewrite, right? Like that's not a valid option. Like there are strategies for doing it, like converting a single page at a time, then maybe a section of your architecture. And then like you basically have all of your invoices are now a single page application, but your quoting is a separate like Rails application. And then you just slowly convert that way. It takes a lot more time. Like building something greenfield is really easy because you don't have to work with a legacy system and make it work the way the legacy system did. So it requires a lot more resources.
I find that it's easy to turn, like the Rails API stuff.
Yep.
Is very easy. You can add it on and use it. So I mean, on a case by case basis, you can start fleshing these things out.
Yeah.
It depends how well you isolate the pieces of your app.
Yeah, I know.
Like anything else, if you have really nice isolated
Yeah.
folders and
It's-
sections, sure you can grab one of those. And
It also
write
depends on whether you've already started to build an API that fits that specification for the
Yeah.
Rails SPA. If you already have an API but it doesn't work for a single page app, then you kind of still have to go back to that especially if you have other things using that API, and you can't really just turf that API, like, that's when you, at that point, you're at a pretty large
Yeah.
scale, and you've got a whole host of other issues, so.
Yeah, I think you're basically like 2 to 10xing your complexity of building your front end.
For sure, yeah.
Quite probably higher, lower. There's no real way to estimate, but it's going to be more complex.
So
Go ahead.
why is this presentation not on Vue? Why did you settle on React?
Primarily because I've used React. So I really, really like Vue. I have no experience with Vue as like a professional developer. I have it as a hobby developer. So I've used Vue in like personal applications and like hobby things, hackathons, and I really like it. But I don't know how it behaves once you kind of like hit that scale of like, I'm actually running into issues that exist in the library, not my code. So like how responsive are they to feedback, and like how well do they document the issues they have? Stuff like that you kind of need to consider in a production application is a lot. I don't have experience with Vue, so I picked React as the presentation. But it's interchangeable. Angular is another pretty good example of an option. Go ahead.
Just real quick, I want to then I've got a question. For the middle, like the hybrid, Vue is better, and I could talk about that more. But one of my strongest views of where I think Vue is very effective is in a place where you've got existing DOM. You have an existing structure and you want to add dynamic logic to it. Something like client-side validations is a great example. You can bolt Vue onto your existing DOMs and just add dynamic behavior in a much more structured way than you'd be doing with something like jQuery. It's great for that. So for the middle thing, I really believe that Vue is a clearly better answer than React. When you get to a full SPA, Vue versus React,
Yeah, take your preference. Yeah.
Is React like open source? Like obviously
Yes.
Facebook
Yeah.
behind it, so it's got like this $1 billion
You can do
support
all
and
the
stuff,
modules
but
that you can.
Vue.js seems to be like the hippie kind of alternative. It's more open source.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
only one that's
Yeah, Vue has like open source roots, whereas like React is backed by a company, and React has in the past had that issue with their licensing a couple years ago, where they tried to like make it anyone who uses React can't sue Facebook. They backpedaled that luckily, and they're back to like the MIT license, but it is a risk with like.
In general, is it a good idea to have like one big company backing like an open source language?
You're
Like,
asking very
yeah,
Well, why don't you look at that?
Yeah.
See what there's an answer came up with that.
please, right? Yeah.
I think the answer is no.
I
Now, of course, it was taken over by Oracle,
I would,
and Oracle has its own issues.
I don't think the ownership is the important question. The important question is what's the governance model. And we've had a lot of really interesting questions. Like we had this with Node, and the whole IOJS course
Yep.
was over this exact thing. And what happened is not change the ownership, but there was an aggressive change to the governance model. And I think in general, the community believes that that's largely been resolved. Like the tensions that created the IOJS org have, with the change to the governance models of Node, resolved the issues that the community was having. But sorry, do you have a question?
Go for it.
Okay, is GraphQL better direction to go than Rust? And if so, is Rails still the right answer if you're building a GraphQL backend?
Right, so GraphQL versus Rails, or sorry, versus a REST API, and if you're going with GraphQL, is that a good option for your Rails backend? On the first question of like which is better, I argue a lot with a friend of mine on this exact topic. I think it goes back to it depends. So I think for a static content site, I would probably go with a REST API because of familiarity and caching. Caching is something that you tend to lose with a GraphQL library. GraphQL, I think, is a better option for applications. It like makes it a little bit easier to like build an application, less data over the wire, which is really nice. I think that could use its own talk and should be discussed a bit more at length. I actually have a comparison doc if anyone wants to see it. But if you're picking GraphQL, I've not personally had the experience of how it works with Rails, but I believe at Jobber they tried it and it wasn't working particularly well. Like the libraries that existed weren't fantastic, but I don't think it was necessarily a deal-breaking restriction. So I think you can use GraphQL with a Rails backend, but I think it is a little bit more difficult than something like Apollo. But this is a Ruby meetup, so Rails is the best.
That makes this very awkward to ask then, why Rails?
Yeah, so I don't know all of the details on why Rails was chosen. I think it was a known framework, and the ORM still lets you move really quickly. Active record is fantastic. Even if you're building it in API-only mode, it's once you start scaling that it starts getting confusing and difficult, but it's still, I think Rails still provides a lot of value in API mode. Even like delayed job, or not delayed job, active job, which you can like use delayed job, sidekick. Like there's a really good back-end architecture for Rails that I think is valuable if you do want to make that choice.
So if you were to use some other language, you'd be moving at half the rate, you feel like? If you
I think I personally would. I think someone experienced with some of the like JavaScript or Apollo backend frameworks, they might be able to move at the same rate, but I'm not that experienced with it, and I don't think the people I'm working with are that experienced with it either. So this is the fastest way that our skill set could move and having it be a reasonable option.
I'm not entirely convinced. They could.
Yep.
But I don't know that there's empirical
Yeah.
stuff that is looked at.
Yeah.
I think it depends on the scale of what you have. Unfortunately, Rails gets overlooked with the speed at which you can really roll things up quite quickly. For backend stuff, APIs alone, it's remarkably fast compared to most of the other frameworks that I've seen. For things that you can do. I don't know about the GraphQL stuff.
Yep.
When I haven't implemented GraphQL, but I mean, from the specifications and what it's attempting to do, I don't see that it's necessarily difficult, even if you were rolling your own implements.
One of the things I've been considering an advantage, because people often talk about how when you separate your view and your back-end logic, you can easily switch out the front end, but one of the things I'm thinking is you can easily switch out the back end.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
So you could conceivably switch over to a second API. You could split up your backends and have two different backends that your single
That's,
source.
yeah, that's a common architecture.
Yeah,
And I mean, like we were discussing earlier, where you split off the back end, and you can actually run a thing that's a Rails API, so you stand it up quickly, and then you move to another technology when that makes sense. And
Yep.
a lot of shops have done that, and swapped out the Rails backend API with like an Elixir.
Yep.
Right?
And one of the really nice things about that is you kind of get, if you keep your backends pretty thin, like you can replace them easily. If you like encode all of your business logic and everything into that backend infrastructure, it gets a little bit more difficult, but it's still doable to swap out.
It's actually a big part of the concepts behind GraphQL is the idea that GraphQL is well suited to be a facade in front of other APIs.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you create as a layer, and then you maybe have the Rails app with the REST API over here and some other service over here.
Yep.
But your actual API is on the
Well, and that
surface.
becomes the end tier that, like,
Yeah.
the traditional Java J2EE stuff was end tier, right? Where you would have multiple tiers between what was
Mhm.
the front end and where your business logic. And the concept is that you could then split these,
Yep.
and implement it on appropriate technologies, all the way up and down the stack.
If you have
Absolutely.
Rails API there, you were talking about like the invoice example of splitting out a little piece of your front
Yeah.
end to a React. So you could do the same thing. You could swap out your invoice backend API for your Phoenix server or whatever, and then keep the other endpoints pointing to your Rails server.
Yep.
Go one chunk at a time.
Yeah, you could
Definitely
separate
piecewise, like
components of
separation.
your
Yeah.
API, which is
Very
another-
cool,
Yeah.
very cool.
Yeah.
That's what's cool about computers. Everything's just like a method call. As long as all the arguments match up, it'll all
Yeah.
work out.
I love your optimism.
Cool. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much.